Hello and welcome to the fifth video in the Introduction to our Workshop series. Hopefully you've seen either the previous videos, already looked through the booklets or attended some of the workshops. These videos are just meant to be another source to help you with the material in the booklet that's part of the workshop. These workshops and these videos are run by the Statistics Unit at QIMR Berghofer. We provide a lot of services to QIMR Berghofer and also Metro North and MARTA researchers. And there are all of our contacts there if you're interested. So today we will be using the script file that was part of all the materials. So there's that code merging data.r. We will be using that file today. So it'd be good if you know, it'd be good if you have that file downloaded, and it'd be good if you know where that file is to set that location as your working directory, like we've covered in previous videos. And we won't need any other packages, but I'm hoping you have RNR Studio on your computer as well. So today we're looking more at data preparation and handling, and it'll be section 13 from the booklet, which is merging data. So quite often in research or just in anything, anytime you're using data, you'll have data from different sources that you might want to merge together. You might have an existing data set, you want to update it with new variables, new cases. You might just have little bits of data floating around that you need to combine together. Or you might even be making data as part of your analysis. You might be making variables, producing things, and you want to combine them in different ways for plotting or for analysis or for lots of different things. Merging is a very core skill for when you're using data. So we're going to be talking about that today. Essentially, there are two ways to merge data. You can merge it vertically, where you add rows to an existing data set, or you can merge horizontally, where you add columns to the existing data set. Of course, this is a very simplified version. There can be cases where you both add rows and columns in a combination. You might add some columns, and not all the existing rows have values in those new columns. Lots of different more complicated scenarios, but vertically and horizontally are the two basic ways to merge. That's the two directions you can merge in. So we're going to start with vertical merging. It's basically when you add rows or cases to your data. Generally, this is only existing variables, and you're just adding more rows or cases in those existing variables. And in R, like in most software, statistical software, the variable names do have to match for it to recognize that you're adding to the same variable. So let's jump across to R now. So I've already got my data frames in there, but this code merging data.r file, what you can, that's a script file that makes a bunch of data frames that we're going to be using today. So what you can do is you can use this source function, then the brackets, and then use quotations, type code merging data.r. For this to work, you need to have your working directory set to where that .r file is saved. So make sure your working directory is set there, and then have this line of code and run it. And what should happen is you get all these different objects in your environment, all these different data frames. They're just a bunch of different data frames that we're going to use to show how different mergings can occur. So to start with, for vertical merging, let's look at the first two data frames. So this is data frame 1 and data frame 2, and they've just got really basic variables in there. There's a character variable that has letters, there's a number variable that has numbers, and a logic variable that has logical values. So if you look at the environment, we'd see that there's 3 different types of variables there. So they're the two things we're going to look at. And so because we've got all these variables named consistently between the two data frames, what we're going to do is combine the rows. So I'm just going to use rbind. Sorry, jumping ahead. What we're going to do to do that is use this function rbind. If we want to put rbind into our help window, we'll get information on rbind and cbind, which is combine objects by rows or columns. So rbind is when we combine by rows. So we're going to put our two data frames into as arguments for the function. And when we run that function, our output is the two data frames combined together with all the information in the matching variables together. So character now has all 6 values, number has all 6 values, and logic has all 6 values. The rows are the exact same. So F6 and true is still on the same row. D4 and false is also the same part of the same row. So the rows haven't changed. We've just combined the two data frames that way. And rbind is a very quick way to do that. We can combine by rows with columns out of order. So previously for data frame 1 and data frame 2, the 3 variables were in the same order of character, number, logic. If you look what I'm doing here, by having that vector in the square brackets, data frame 1, that's 3, 1, 2, I'm outputting df1 out of order. I'm making the third column come first and then the first and second column. So having that square bracket there is making the data frame go out of order. But then when I use rbind on that out of order data frame and the second data frame, it will still match the corresponding variables together. So the order of variables now is logic, character, number, because the first data frame in the rbind function has that order. And rbind will recognize that, okay, it will get the corresponding variables from data frame 2 and match them up with the first one. This only works for data frames, obviously, because data frames are the only ones that have named columns. If we were just combining 2 vectors of numbers, so 1, 2, 3 and 2, 3, 4, it's just going to combine them like that. There's no real knowledge of them being out of order, but in that case, it's not matching by name. So it can work on data frames or it can work on just on numbers, but we're going to focus mainly just on data frames. One of the good things about rbind is that it can combine many objects at once. So here, my first object is data frame 1 with the order mixed up again. So this time it's character, logic, number. And I'm also going to combine onto the bottom of that data frame 2, but then also data frame 1 again. So I can just keep putting the same data frames in there, and it will just keep adding them at the bottom. So we've got at the top data frame 1 out of order. So character, logic, number. And then data frame 2 reordered to be the same way as that first input data frame. And then data frame 1 again. So even though the second time I added data frame 1, I didn't change the order, rbind has corrected the order to match the first data frame input. We jumped through quite a few things there. So just in summary, the function rbind can combine data frames. You would generally need all variables to match. So you need all the data frames in there to have the same number of variables, all be called the same name, as we have here. So if that's the case and you're just really quickly trying to combine things of the same size, this will be the way to do it. If, for example, we had an object that didn't have a number variable, we might add just a blank number variable to make sure that happens. Okay. Now, horizontal merging. The thing with horizontal merging is we don't necessarily know if all the cases are in the same order when we add new variables. Because the first data set, we might have the variables in different order. I'm sorry, not the variables, the cases in a different order than to the second data frame. If they are already in the same order of like patient 1, patient 2, patient 3, all ordered the same, we can just simply bind them together like we just did with rbind. But otherwise, we'll have to combine it with some identifying variable to match which row matches with which. When we did it with in vertical merging, when the variables were out of order, the variable names were able to identify which variable is which. In horizontal merging, when the rows are out of order, we do need to find some variable to match which row matches which in the two data frames we're merging. So let's jump back to R. So let's look at these two data frames. We've got data frame 1 again. We also have data frame 4. Data frame 1 had character, number, logic. Data frame 4 has a character variable, a date variable, and also this celebrity variable, which is just a person's name. So we could just match by the placement in the order they're already in with the function Cbind, which is very similar to Rbind. We need the two data frames to have the same number of rows, and Cbind will just put them right next to each other. So we have all of data frame 1 there, and then we have data frame 4. Notice character is in there twice because character is a variable that's in both of them. Cbind has just essentially just taken the two data frames and put them next to each other, assuming that they're both in the same ordering of rows. However, we can use that common column of character to combine the two data frames more accurately. And we can do that with the function merge. So merge is when you can only use two data frames for merge. So merge, you get your first and your second data frame, and then use the argument by to say by which variable you are merging the two data frames. But which variable is the common identifying variable. In this case, it's the variable character. So I've got character there in quotation marks. Remember that. So if I run this line of code, I now see that my resulting data frame only has character there once. So it's got the three variables from data frame 1, and then the two variables from data frame 4, date and celebrity, that weren't in data frame 1, but the second instance of character isn't there. It's been used to combine the two. So that's how you can merge by a common column. You use the variable by. You can also refer to a column by number. So if you don't have if you don't want to use the column name, you can just use the column number. So we could use, because character is the first column in both data sets, we could just use by 1 for the first column, and that would work as well. This might help if in your data frames you have weird column names that change each time you use the code, if you're trying to replicate code each time, but you know the identifying variable will be always in the first column. Again, you might not use that. I tend to always use the character, the variable names, but it's up to you how you choose to use these skills. Now, merging can always get more complicated depending on what you want to do. We've done fairly simple ones here, but there's always more complicated ones to do it. So let's look at data frame 5, which is a bit larger, and it has lots of a larger character variable, number, and logic. So it just seems to be a really big data frame 1. Let's look at data frame 6. It has number, character, and this little message variable, which all just seems to be random selections of text. So we can try and combine these two variables, but we can try and merge these two data frames, but we can see that it has two common variables that identify it. Because with an identifying variable, we need it to be unique each time. So in previous variables, character for A, B, and C, it uniquely identified a row, whereas in these larger data frames, none of the variables uniquely identify a single row. Character has repeated values, as does number, but the combination of character and number does uniquely identify rows. So A1, B1, C1, and then A2, that combination of character and number does uniquely identify rows. And this is very common in other data sets as well, especially if you have, say, repeated measurements. or things like that, where it won't be a single, may not be a single variable that uniquely identifies the row, but maybe a combination of two or more. So same with the data frame 6, we have 1A, 2A, 3A, 1B, etc. So we can merge these two data frames based on those two variables. So how we do that is we have our merge function, we have our two data frames, df5 and df6, and then in by, we'll have a vector of the variable names that we're using. So by equals, we're going to create a vector of names with C, and then we'll have the two variable names. So we've got character and we've got number. So remember when we were talking about like the basic skills in the very early videos about why it's important to know your data types? Because we can look at our help function, we can find out that by needs to be a vector of names to use. We know we need to use C to make a vector of character values of names variables. So it's just one of those little things where the skills build on each other. So we've got a vector here of character and name. If we run that line of code, we can see here that data frame 5 and data frame 6 have been combined. So we've got the logic and the message values in there now with the uniquely identifying character and number variables there. Notice how we've got things sorted with character first, because character was the first variable we put into the vector for by, and then we have number. So the uniquely identifying variables will go at the front, with the first one in the vector going at the very front, and then the rest of the vector. Then we have logic, because that came from the first data frame we put in to merge, and then message comes from the second data frame. You'll also look how the result, the output data frame is sorted. It's sorted by character. So because character was the first variable in there, it's sorted the results by character and then by number. That's just what R does by default, because when you merge by different variables, it knows that the row order may change, especially if the row order is different between the two data frames. So it's just going to automatically sort it there by those identifying variables that we're merging on. We can of course change that. So here I've got the merge, and instead the vector is now number then character. And that is now changed it so that number is first, then character, and the order of the rows is now changed because it's sorted by number first, then by character. And then you can see here that when I was making this code, possibly very late at night, I thought I was very funny by making the message make sense once you sorted it that way. It's not that interesting, so don't read too much into that, but I would recommend looking up the wrap function because it can be useful. Moving on. Now you may ask, what if I have, when I'm combining my two data frames, the variable that I want to combine on is called different things in each data frame? Well, you can. If we look at data frame 3, we have here letter numeric T/F, as opposed to character number logic. They're all called something different here. And if we look at data frame 7, it just has character, like we've seen before, calling that variable character, date, and celebrity. If you're wondering who these people are in the celebrity column, they are famous statisticians, because, you know, statistics. So we have character in one variable and character in one data frame and letter in the other data frame. You can obviously see that they're the corresponding variables that we can match on, but they are called different things. And so instead of renaming variables, which of course we could do, but sometimes it's just easier not to do that because you might want to keep that old data frame as it is for whatever reason. We can merge and then name each variable separately. So in merge, we've got data frame 3 and then data frame 7. And then instead of by, we can use by.x and by.y. So by.x is the argument saying we will look, this is the variable from the first data frame that you're using to merge on. So for the first data frame, which is data frame 3, that'll be the variable letter. And then for the second data frame, which will be data frame 7, that'll be the variable character. So when I do those two, I get the results of combining them all together into the one data frame. You'll notice that the result data frame will use the variable name from the X or the first data frame in merge. So because obviously they're named differently, R will use the first data frame's variable name. If you wanted it around the other way, you could always just switch your two data frames around and switch your X and Y around. Merge can have little finicky things, so I'd always suggest looking up the help function for merge to see what different other arguments it may have. But we will look over some other merge arguments now. So we'll notice here that all of the data frames we have been merging are all the same number of rows. That won't always be the case. In sometimes you might have one of the data frames might have less rows, might have more rows, and they might have rows that just don't match together at all. So again, let's look a bit into that. So we've got data frame 1 here, which we saw originally had character, number, and logic. But this time, let's look at data frame 4, but let's only look at the first 2 rows. So I'm doing that just by using square brackets with a 1 to 2 before the comma, and then nothing after the comma for all the columns. So we've previously combined data frame 1 and data frame 4, but back then we had this 3 rows in each, combining by character. This time I'm only using data frame 4 with 2 rows. So when I merge it like I had before, using the variable character as my input to by, this time I only get 2 resultant rows. I only get the rows that are shared in both data frames. Basically, R has said, okay, in the second data frame in my merge function, which is data frame 4, but only the first 2 rows, there is no C value for character. There is no row matching that other row in data frame 1. So there's no row in the result for that. You can change that though, using the argument all. So add another argument all, and if you say all equals true, in the results, all possible rows are put into the output, and the empty gaps are just filled with NA. So again, this time I only have data frame 4 with the first 2 rows there. And so when I combine it, only the first 2 rows of data frame 4 are there, and that third row that matches with C in character, there isn't any result there, so R just puts NA. So this can be a way to make sure that all the data is still there when you merge, even if the rows aren't matched between the 2 data frames. You will also note when we've previously done by.x and by.y to be specific for each data frame, there is also an all.x and an all.y option as well. Say if you only wanted to keep all the rows in one of the data frames but not the other. All these things will make much more sense once you start working with them with a data frame of your own, I've got to say. The best thing to do is just get some data sets yourself and start merging them around when need be, or when it comes time for you to do it for a project, take the time to see what you're doing and make sure it's doing properly. It's the best way to learn R is by doing. Okay. So yeah, another thing to be aware of is common columns not used in by are doubled. So what do I mean by that? Let's look at data frame 1. We've got character number logic, and let's look at data frame 8. Data frame 8 has character, also got number, and then it's got this location variable. I cannot remember why I called that location, but hey, sure. It was probably late at night. So in this data set, we've got a character, the variable character, which we will be wanting to combine our two variables with. It's the uniquely identifying variable in both. But then we've also got that number variable, and both data sets have a number variable, but it doesn't match. They don't share values. It's obviously something different. So we're not going to use that in our by input. But when we do merge them then, what that means is that number gets a suffix added to it so that we can tell which data frame that number variable came from. So this number.x variable comes from the first data frame, so data frame 1, so we know what that one came from. And then we have number.y to know that this number variable came from the second data frame. So this can be important for two reasons. Or this whole concept can be important for two reasons. One, if you do have a common column in both data frames or a common variable that is the same, if you don't put it in by and you're using a by input, R won't automatically combine it for you. So if you've picked the variables you're using to combine the two data frames on, but there are other common variables that you haven't included, R won't automatically combine them for you because it's not going to know if you do want those separate or not. So that can be important to make sure you're aware of all the common variables, because you can use as many common variables as you want, even if it's in excess. So you should be aware of that so that you're not having too many duplicates of variables in your resulting data set. But it's also good to be aware that if you do have the same name variables in both, but you want to keep them separate, like we do here, because then don't have the same data, for starters, maybe you should consider changing the name of one of them beforehand. Or when it comes here, you'll notice that both the variable names change. So if you want to use one of those variables in the resulting data set, the name has changed. It won't be the same name as before. These are just always things to be aware of. And a lot of these little tricky things become much easier once you've just spent some time actually merging data in R. And once you've got your data in R and you're playing with it, you're working in it, everything starts to click a bit more. So that's why I encourage you to do R. Working in R is the best way to learn R. So over time, you'll get used to things like this. And as you work more in merging data in R, you can look up all the other inputs into the merge, or the arguments of the merge function, stuff like suffixes, where you can pick your own suffixes that get added, and stuff like sort, where it will decide whether it sorts for you or not. You can look at all those things. I'm just trying to go over the real basics here today so you can start using merge by yourself. Okay, some other things that we can do. So Rbind and Cbind, which we talked about earlier, are fairly basic, quick functions when you just want to match things together really quickly, and you know they're going to match, you're aware of what's happening, and you put it together really quickly. They can be really good if you've just got little vectors of data that you want to combine together from your results or something, and for quick matching of data frames. Merge is the much more versatile function. So, and there's some other tricks we can learn with this as well. If we look at data frame 1, which is character number logic, and data frame 3, all different variables. A little trick you can do is you can set by to be null. And what that does is it makes a result output of all the different combinations of the rows in the two data frames. So we can see here that so for the first row of data frame 2, it's been matched with all 3 rows of data frame 1. Same with the second and the third row. Again, this may not be useful for what you're looking to use merge for, but there might be instances where this is useful and you actually want this. Depends what you're trying to create or do with your analysis. That's just a cool little trick to know. So also in comparing merge to rbind and cbind, merge can be an alternative to rbind only if all the column names are the same and only for 2 data frames. So if you go merge df1 and df2 and say all equals true, it will still combine them, just like rbind would have done back in the beginning. So if you only want to use merge rather than cbind, rather than rbind, I mean, you just want to stick with one function because that makes sense to you, you can do that. All these options are possible too. It's really up to you about how you want to do things. I will say though, the one thing with merge is that it only does 2 data frames at a time, whereas rbind and cbind can do many more. Again, you may not be in the situation where you want to combine more than 2 data frames at once, in which case merge might be your go-to function. But realistically, I think it's good to be aware of both, sorry, not both, of each of cbind, rbind, and merge. They're all really useful functions in different situations. Of course, they can be, in some cases, used interchangeably, but it is really good to be aware of all those things there. Yeah, thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you're a bit more across the merging capabilities in R now, using merge, cbind, or rbind. And yeah, I try out the examples and activities in the booklet and check out the other videos, and hope to see you at workshops if I haven't seen you there already. Thank you very much.